So what we're going to talk about today is publication and reporting. And to start this off, I want you to think about the experiences that you have with publication and reporting, right? So think about examples in which you personally have exhibited avoidance behaviors, right? So for example, procrastination with respect to publication and reporting in any of your current or past research projects. Little uncomfortable? We're going to talk about behaviors today, okay? And so when we see human behavior, right, if we think about the research process, so this slide actually comes from the MD Anderson Square training, and it's an expansive training. But what we see is up here above ground, right, when we think about our tree. We see things such as self-initiating or procrastinating. We see focus behaviors. We see organization or disorganization, right? But what we don't see are the executive functions that underpin all that, right? So all these things that are underground. I'm not going to specifically get into what these are. Great reference as to where this came from, as well as the MD Anderson training. I do want to flesh this out more in a future presentation, but I just don't have time today. But what I am going to talk about is avoidance-motivated behavior, which can produce procrastination, right? And so what is avoidance-motivated behavior? What it is, it's our behavior when we distract ourselves from doing something that we should be doing, right? That is associated with an unpleasant emotion. Typically, that unpleasant emotion is fear, okay? And so sometimes this is also known as approach avoidance. And there are three main types of behaviors that we see. There is complete avoidance, right? Where you no-show out a presentation, or you fail to submit documents. Maybe you quit a responsibility unexpectedly. Another type of avoidance behavior is escape, right? Where you leave early from a commitment, you end a talk abruptly, or you hide in your office, right? Your PI is coming and you don't want to have to show data that they've been expecting. And then there are forms of partial avoidance, such as daydreaming or avoiding eye contact, right? And feelings that are associated with these behaviors are things such as worry, anxiety, panic. And these behaviors actually don't reduce our anxiety, rather they can fuel it or cause difficult situations to snowball, right? And so what is avoidance-motivated coping, right? We do something instead of what we should be doing in order to bring a momentary term of relief, right? Number one way we do that, we procrastinate, right? And there are comics in the academic space talking about our tendency for procrastination. There's the one graph from PhD Comics, and then there's also the field guide to procrastinators. You can identify your individual type or subtype. Personally, I am a cleaner and a snacker. I know that about myself. Modern procrastination, these are our four horsemen. This is just to be funny, right? And so napping, snacks, social media, minor chores are all things that we sometimes turn to in order to get away from these unpleasant feelings. And so when we're doing avoidance-motivated coping, it's to bring that momentary relief. We're not doing, in this range of normal behavior, are things such as data fabrication or data falsification, okay? These are not things that are within the normal scope, okay? So if you are having these fears, right, you should not be doing this. Thumbs up. Okay. Lots of guidance on what data fabrication and falsification are. Great talks this morning about it. There is the question about images, the question about, so actually this is a really, really great resource. I'm pretty sure that you get access to these slides, but there was actually a blog on Frontiers that actually talks about like image manipulation in Western blots. So if you have questions about that, I would take a look at that. Recommend taking a look at that. And so why do we exhibit these avoidance behaviors in publication or reporting? Typically, we have some type of fear, right? Whether it be fear of failure or there's some type of pressure, right? It could be pressure to have high impact publication or publications. It could be lab or peer pressure or even employment or visa pressure, right? And so when you're feeling these things, it's a good idea to have a support system, whether it be, your friend in the lab, a friend, a family member, or even larger support systems to talk through these, right? Because when we don't talk through these things, that's where these things can snowball, okay? Other issues that can come up, difficulty with time management. I'm going to talk a bit about time management today. One of the things that we don't realize as we transition from being a graduate student, laboratory tech, into like more roles, you would say, with responsibility, postdocs, professorships, research scientists, is that there's just more and more administrative load that you'll be taking on as you transition career roles, and it takes more time than you think, right? And it takes you away from those productivity pieces. And our publication reporting deadlines can create time conflicts with our other commitments, right? And these are just normal things that happen. It could be conflict with family responsibilities. It could be conflict with teaching responsibilities, depending on the teaching load of your institution, service responsibilities, travel, whether it be for work-related or non-work related. Okay? What other behaviors do we have? We're going to have this feeling of a lack of progress, right? Often, as academics, we feel like we have not been productive enough, which can be paralyzing. The key is to not be paralyzed by this. There are reasons why, truly legitimate reasons why we might have a lack of progress. Maybe we are having difficulty in acquiring needed information or materials, right? So during COVID, a lot of the shutdowns, some of the materials that we needed for research were just not available, right? And so that lack of progress, that was real, tangible, documentable, right? But also progress can feel like a moving target, even when we have all the resources that we need. So when we have these behaviors that are manifesting, right, what does it cause? It can cause missed deadlines, delayed publications, late reports to regulatory and funding entities, as well as negative impacts of promotion tenure and or career development, right? And so usually when we think about these impacts, we think about the personal impacts, right? I'm going to talk later in this presentation about what the impacts are to the field. Okay? But before I get there, I do want to define what products of research are. So typically, when we think about products of research, we're thinking about those peer-reviewed publications in top-tier journals, right? That might also come with open access requirements for data produced. That's becoming more and more common. Products of research can include conference papers or podium presentations, as well as abstracts, conference papers, tech development, including inventions, patent applications such as non-provisionals or provisional patent applications. That's what MPA and PPA stand for. They could be licensing agreements, or it could be other materials, right? So such as physical collections, audiovisual products, software, instrumentation, research tools. There's just a lot of different things that can fall under this. All right. So when we think about publication reporting, who does the work? So our PIs and our co-Is are typically senior authors, but really it's your postdocs, your research assistants, your graduate students, possibly even undergraduate students and lab techs that are really doing a lot of this work, right? And so typically these are team efforts that the PI is going to supervise, right? And the PI is going to have multiple projects going on, but most of the work is done by our junior scientists. That being said, avoidance happens at all levels, right? It's not just you, I promise you, right? Your PI is doing it too. You just may not see it. So what types of reporting is in research? And so some of you may be familiar with the different levels. So if you just think, your initial projects, you're probably going to be reporting to the department, center, or university. If you have human subjects, you're reporting to the Institutional Review Board. If you have animal subjects, you're reporting to IACUC. You might also have federal regulatory bodies, such as the FDA, you have to report to. And then obviously you're funding your funders, right? And so it could be at the federal level, the state level, local, or even private foundations. And so, like I said, as we transition from being a junior scientist into further career development, what happens is, and this is I thought this was a joke when I first saw this graph, as a postdoc, most of the time you're going to be able to spend the time in the lab or just do your research, which is in purple over here. Your first academic position, you get pulled in about 1,000 different directions. It is true. And you ask yourself, why? Start talking to the junior faculty now as to why that happens and how you can manage that. Because if you don't have a support system in place, that is going to be extremely stressful. Okay, so let's get back to that reporting aspect, right? And so the research performance progress reports. These are typically, there's some type of format mandate. Usually what happens is federal institutions have a specific format that they want, and most other institutions or bodies will adopt very similar guidelines. And so you'll have an idea of what you probably will need to report if you've been paying attention to the federal guidelines. Okay? Typically, only the PI or noted delegate can initiate it, and so you might think, I'm the PI, why do I have to do anything administrative? This could be a condition of you receiving the funding. Okay, so you have to do it. Majority of the work is likely done by a PI, but there are some institutions that have administrative staff that can help you with this. If you are one of those institutions, please leverage that resource. Okay, I'm at an institution that this has been a struggle, particularly through COVID. Okay, administrative resources have not been great. A lot of times it's the PI doing all this. Like, I've actually gotten to the point where I've had to submit entire grants by myself because of low administrative support. All right. So you need to know what your responsibilities are. When you're submitting these reports, what does this look like? So obviously you're going to be reporting back on your accomplishments to whether the funding body or to the regulatory board. What were the major goals? Were they achieved? Training opportunities, professional development, did those things happen? Were results disseminated? Are they open access? And what is the plan for the next period? Like I said, publications and products, those would be reported, or if you have preliminary data, you can present that. Any patient or animal recruitment and or safety reports would have to be generated. If there's collaborative efforts such as multi-site projects or a project where there are PIs at different, or co-Is at different institutions, you would have to collate materials from those institutions together. And so, like, for example, if I have a grant as a PI, but I have a collaborator over at Rice, and they're receiving some funding, and I have to report back to the funding board, I would need a full report from the Rice location to send along with the report from my location, right? And that's your responsibility as a PI to make sure that all that comes in. Additional components of these required reports, are you making an impact, right? So some of these funding agencies really want to know what the impact of your work is. What else? Project changes, challenges, and problems, particularly over the past 5 years. These are things that we have had to deal with, whether it be Hurricane Harvey, right, and flooding, all the way up to our lab got completely shut down for 14 months due to COVID, right? You have to say if these things happened, what impact they had on your group or your lab or your institution, and how you're going to overcome them, right? How you're going to overcome them, not just scientifically, but if there's budget constraints, there's different things that you're going to have to explain in these reports. Okay? You can't just assume that they know everything. You have to provide a justification if there's going to be changes. If you're dealing with money, you're going to have to talk about how much money you spent, what it went to, and if there's been project changes, challenges, and problems, you often have to justify any changes to your budgets. Some entities have very, very strict rules as to how you can do that. So you can't just be like, hey, I'm going to move this money from this pot over into this category, okay? So for example, like NSF and NIH have very, very strict categories on how you do that. Be familiar with your institutional rules on to how to do those things. That's where that administrative support can be extremely, extremely helpful, right? So yes, when you get money to do things, but that doesn't just mean it's carte blanche, right? There are rules. All right, and like I said, if there are future plan changes or modifications, you do have to report those. All right, so those are the nitty gritty. Am I scaring y'all yet? Just a little bit, okay. Well, let's talk about so we're gonna transition from talking about what reporting requirements are to, in terms of like funding entities, right? And let's transition to talking about things that are core reporting standards and manuscripts. So when we're looking at manuscripts that are produced as a product of research, things that you should be looking for, hallmarks, right? You should be looking for randomization. If you're dealing with, animal samples, human samples, is there some form of randomization, right? Did they report it? Did they not report it? Okay. You should also be looking for blinding, whether it be single blinding, double blinding, triple blinding, whatever blind that they use. Did they use it? All right. And how did they actually do it? You should also be looking for sample size calculations and estimation, right? And so appropriate sample sizes should be calculated and should be utilized. And the statistical details of the computation should be reported, including variability measures, right? So this is like an example I have from one of my grants. And here, I have all 3 of my aims and measures under all 3 aims. I talk about my groups, and I show at, an 80% power, how many I would need. And what you do and what you should be doing is you should be powering to the weakest aim, right? And so my weakest aim clearly here is aim 2. So based on this, I would need 21 individuals in each group in order to conduct the study, right? Because if I only ended up recruiting 10, I'm not going to be appropriately powered at that aim, right? And so this is another thing that when you're writing grants, this is something to be very, very, very aware of. If you are extremely vague in your statistical details, you have just shot yourself in the foot, okay? When you're discrete like this, it will help your reviewers figure out what's going on. And if you only power to one aim, it is unclear if your study is appropriately powered for all aims, all hypotheses. So I really strongly recommend this, particularly as a study section chair. What else should you be looking for? You should be looking for information about data handling, right? So when were data collection stopped? Was there a reason why it was stopped, right? Your inclusion-exclusion criteria. How were outliers handled? Were there primary and secondary endpoints defined? Was there any missing data, and what could have caused the missing data? And were there replicates, basically, right? Okay, so pretty standard stuff that you would do. However, when we start thinking about like method sections, those are the ones that we're usually condensing, right? And trying to just squeeze in, like squeeze out the maximal, like, or just make it as short as possible, right? Okay, so some of the things that I've been getting to in hurdles in publication and reporting, project changes, challenges, and problems, right? And so this can manifest not only in grants, but in publications. And so when we are running our labs for the very first time in particular, there can be difficulty starting and running a project. Even restarting a lab, right? So like I said, for example, my lab over at U of H was shut down for 14 months. Getting things back up and running again after that was extremely difficult. It has still been difficult to bring human subjects into the lab. And so it can be issues in instrumentation, participant recruitment, animal procurement, I know has been an issue for one of my collaborators. Lab staff, time funding, right? So these are all real challenges that can, everything else can be perfect and we have the best intentions, but these things can stand in our way. If those things still aren't standing in our way, one of the things that really can happen is that there could be difficulty organizing required information by our stated deadlines, right? So like I talked about, those time conflicts, those communication challenges, right? You could be doing everything absolutely right? But if you're waiting to the very, very end, right before the deadline to submit your materials, this is where things can go absolutely wrong. Maybe somebody's out of the office, or maybe they're not responsive. Maybe they no longer work for the institution. Right? So what is your plan for gathering that information that you might need for that regulatory report? Also, depending on your institution, you may have a lot of administrative support. That's awesome. Please leverage that. Please know the resources that you can use for that. It's better to know now than it is to know late in the game, because if there is little to no institutional support, you are the one running the show completely, right? You're the one in the laboratory leading the project, as well as the person behind the desk that's submitting all of the regulatory reports. And it takes a lot of time to collate these pieces of information. And knowing what these pieces of information sometimes can be difficult, particularly in the beginning. And so if it is so tough to do all of this, why bother, right? Why do we bother being scientists? Because we love it, right? We know that there's all these negative consequences. We can have withdrawal of funding, we can have an inability to support current and future projects, and issues with our career progression, right? But, so those are all personal impacts, right? There are larger impacts to the field when we have these difficulties. What does that look like? So if we have a lack of publication and reporting, it means that different biases can be introduced into the evidence base. The very first one being reporting bias, right, which is a selective revealing or suppression of information or study outcomes, where we report some results but not all results. or we spin unexpected or undesirable results, right? So if you don't report, biases can persist within the database. There's also publication biases, which is essentially non-publication of results, typically due to the failure of an intervention. There can be outcome reporting biases. This is also known as your expectation bias, right? Where there's selective reporting of results, modification of hypotheses to fit the findings, right? And we're less likely to report adverse outcomes. This comes in the form of suppression, which can be highly problematic for drug and device trials. Other biases that can creep up in the evidence base. Citation biases, where we tend to cite positive findings more frequently, which can lead to the perception that an intervention is truly more effective than it is due to the differential number of citations in the positive direction, which essentially is an overrepresentation of positive findings. There's also location biases, right, where this is referring to the journal publication and the impact factor. Studies with positive and significant results tend to be published in journals with higher impact factors and with better access, right? So just like your PubMed, your Scopus, things like that, just better access. What other biases? Just a few more. Language bias, publication of positive findings in English language as opposed to other languages, or non-significant results might be published in non-English language journals, which will definitely impact your meta-reviews and your systematic review results. Time lag bias, this is one that we definitely do see a lot, where it's the rapid publication of exciting but not complete results. And this delay in publication of any negative or non-significant findings really can change the story that's being told. This also can happen if in the form of salami science, which I don't know if that term is still used, where publication is delayed, if the PI is trying to boost productivity under certain grant, and they like slice the science as possibly as thin as they could do for like a minimal study, right? And they just publish them all together. And then lastly, funding bias, right? Funding bias is a tendency of a scientific study to report the interests of the study's financial sponsor, where predetermined conclusions may bias researchers into that expectation bias or that outcome reporting bias. And so in order to deal with this, we have these conflict of interest documents that we now have to fill out, where with institutions, if there's any perceived conflict of interest, particularly regarding funding biases, we have to be careful about managing that earlier on. We've become much, much better as, I would say, scientists doing this in recent years to avoid study designs that could be flawed from the start. And so how do we address bias in publication and reporting? We're going to build a case in which negative results produce a positive impact to the evidence base. We don't suppress our results, particularly non-significant results. We don't rush or delay, but also we don't dual submit. That I saw very early on in my career, and I haven't seen it since. We avoid publishing the same results in one or more manuscripts unless there's a really, really good reason, and journals will ask that when you submit your manuscripts. You should be considering the impact factor, scope, and influence of the journals that you're reporting in. Try to balance the story that you tell, and use references from journals that adhere to the guidelines that we've been talking about. So once again, don't withhold critical information. Discuss team authorship and expectations early on in the process. This is the one thing that I keep on saying more and more frequently, is that the earlier on you talk about these things, the better the communication is with the team, particularly with junior team members, right? Have those expectations, those difficult conversations early on. It will make your life a lot easier later on. Be organized, right? If you are not an organized person, this is the one time to challenge that, right? Be organized. But set realistic goals for yourself and your team, right? SMART goals is a great way to go. And communicate. If you take nothing else away from my talk today, communicate, 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 okay? When you communicate with others, you are more likely to succeed in team science. When we are considering strategies for addressing biases, please report on the following: your randomization techniques, your use of blinding, your sample size estimations, and your data handling. You should be doing these things. You should be expecting your colleagues to do these things, right? So look at these in the evidence base, look at these in the grants that you're reviewing, right? We want that transparency. And so like you just heard from Dr. Eitzen, talking about Alcoa principles for managing data quality, use those principles. There's a reason why I have this on the slide, right? It will help you maintain your data integrity. Know the strengths and weaknesses of your team. Know your deadlines, your resources, what you need, whether it be a physical resource or an administrative resource, and know the expectations of your editors, your review boards, your funders, and your institution, right? Going into this, it's like going into battle. The more armor and the more resources you have, the better likely an outcome is going to be, right? And sometimes those resources are just mental resources. So, as we wrap up, what I want to do is I want to challenge you to a New Year's resolution, right? Every day can be the start of a new year. So I want you to discuss within your tables, I want you to think about what you and or your lab can do this year, starting today, to improve your relationship with publication, reporting, and biases, right? I want you to come up with a minimum of 2 to 3 resolutions and implementation strategies that you can share, right? So here we go. So you got those marker boards. Have at it.
One thing that came up in our discussion was just having more like informal communication beyond just lab meetings every week, and like particularly with group projects and team projects, like talking about expectations for authorship and what people's roles are going to be in the project, expectations even for just like keeping the lab clean and organized, and just like doing that at the start of the project and then also throughout.
Awesome. Great. Who wants to add on? Anything? Okay, another group. All right, could you, Stan, thanks.
I think for us, we were talking about, again, communicating, but, setting goals, basically, whether it's for publication, whether it's for grant reports, progress reports, for example, and then, coming together as a team, as a lab, and expressing what those goals are, and then delegating those goals to team members to try to sort of get it done, as opposed to just trying to get everyone doing everything, and sort of just focusing people on doing the right things.
Absolutely, and one of the things I do in terms of timelines, I do recommend having soft deadlines, because like hard deadlines, if you wait till the very last minute, it can be extremely difficult, right? So great. Anyone else want to share? Sharing. It's okay. It's safe. No, there's 2 tables. Who has not shared? Okay, sorry. Here we go. Could you stand up? Oh, sure. Yeah.
So one thing we talked about was sort of normalizing when we have like lab meetings or meetings with your PI of like not starting that reporting bias early by just showing all your data, and having that be like a good starting point that you can keep the ball rolling with that.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really great point. Sometimes we are afraid to be vulnerable in that way. But that is just a fact of life, right? And so if there is an issue, maybe we can catch it earlier on, right? And save some of the resources, including our time and our own sanity, right? And so raw data is not a bad thing to share. Anyone else? Okay, great.
We talked a bit about data handling and just evaluating the current status and quality of data handling in your lab, and being honest with yourself about what it is, where you are now and what you're doing well and what you maybe need to work on, and then slowly, a little bit at a time, adopting or making sure all of your processes and protocols are recorded, that you're saving original files and then saving copies to manipulate them if you feel that you need to, and just making sure that you're standardizing file naming so that everyone in the lab is doing the same thing and understanding, setting things up the same way. That way there's just one system, and the hardest part of that is going to be adoption of everyone on the team, of course.
Right.
But if you can get the heavy lift, then things move forward. It's all about kind of changing the mindset into a space where you're spending as much time on the storage and handling of the data as you do on the collecting and analyzing of the data.
Yes, particularly as we get more and more open access, that's going to be very, very, very key. So, there's another one. Great discussions happening. This is very exciting.
So sometimes, like in the lab, we get lost in all the technical details and the data. But I like to talk about the big picture and the ideas. So sometimes I think we should take a break and think about the big picture and not all the technical aspect. And the other thing that I think is important and is exactly opposite to the first point is talking about controls. So because sometimes we don't pay a lot of attention to the experimental design and especially the controls that we're using in our experiments, and that changes the way we think about the data and outcomes a lot. So I think paying attention to the controls is very important.
And that's something that for NIH reporting, particularly for grants, it's becoming more and more important. I see more and more reviewers pick up on that.